A lantern shines but casts no shadow. What truth hides in its glow? Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravella. Tell me where you're listening from. I can't wait to read your comments. Now let's begin. A raw November fog lay upon Baker Street that morning, the kind that muffles the hooves and makes the lamps look like dull, floating planets. I had scarcely set down my cup when Holmes, who had been stretched full length upon the settee with his gaze fixed upon the nicotine-stained ceiling, sat up with such abruptness that the Persian slipper slid from the mantel and clattered to the hearth. "Footsteps of a man who does not trust his own memory," he said, tilting his head toward the stairs. "You'll hear him pause at the landing to rehearse the order of his appeal." A moment later, there came the very hesitation Holmes had predicted, followed by a resolute knock. I opened the door to admit a thin gentleman in a travelling coat, shiny with damp, a leather bag hooked over one arm. His neat grey whiskers trembled with the effort of self-command. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, though the certainty in his eye suggested he had matched the room to its legend already. Holmes rose with languid grace. "And you, if I mistake not, are Mr. Gideon Hartwell, lecturer in applied physics, lately attached to the Royal Institution, and more lately removed from it in some haste." Our visitor started. Upon my word, how—" "Your bag, sir, though wiped, shows a dusting of the very white which clings to the back of your left sleeve. It is the thin calcined film that settles after magnesium combustion. The Royal Institution imprint upon your notebook is faint but legible. The haste, however, I infer from the unmatched boots. Your right heel has been mended with a darker leather than the left, the work of 2 hands, and not your usual cobbler. Pray sit. Dr. Watson will see you warmed." I stirred the fire into a cheerier glow while our visitor complied, gripping the arms of the chair as if to anchor himself to sanity. "It is Professor Alistair Venn," he said. "He is dead. And there is something in the manner of it, which has turned the more sensible men of Scotland Yard into superstitious children. I'm ashamed to say it has had a similar effect upon me." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Professor Venn, the optical theorist. A mind like a knife edge. You assisted him?" "I was his assistant in the laboratory at Waygate House, Bloomsbury. Last night, rather early this morning, he was found lying beside his work table, a small wound at the temple where the police say he must have struck the corner of an iron retort stand in a fall. Inspector Lestrade calls it misadventure." Hartwell swallowed. "But the room, Mr. Holmes. The room was full of light, though no shadows were to be seen." Holmes's expression sharpened. "No shadows?" "None, sir. Not of man or instrument, chair or crucible. The light came from a lantern, his lantern set upon the central table. It burned, heavens, how it burned! And yet every object stood out as if painted without a single shade upon it. I swear to you that when I held up my hand before the wall, it cast no penumbra, no crisp outline, nothing. It was as though the light rose from every point in the room equally. I could not refrain from an exclamation. The play of shadow is as much the proof of light as echo is of sound. To speak of a lamp without shadow was to speak of rain without wet. Holmes's eyes had taken on the keen, cold brightness I knew so well. "State the circumstances with precision." Hartwell gathered himself. Professor Venn had been engaged for months upon experiments with luminous materials and the diffusion of light. He maintained that the eye is misled by the tyranny of the point source, and that a properly contrived luminescence could render shadow a relic of barbarous lighting. We laughed at his phrase. Last evening I left him at 10 of the clock in perfect spirits. He had received a visitor at 9:30, a gentleman whose card he did not show me, and dismissed him within 10 minutes. At 10, Professor Venn requested solitude. At 2 in the morning, the housekeeper, Mrs. Emmeline Pike, smelled a sharp metallic odor and saw a glare beneath the laboratory door. She fetched the porter. Together they broke in. The professor lay on the floor, face turned to his left, the lantern blazing upon the table. They swear there were no shadows, not even of the smoke that curled from the wick. They roused me from my rooms across the square. "I confirm it all. Your metallic odor," said Holmes. "Magnesium, I should have said, or something of that family. But there was no telltale flare residue one expects from flash powder, no scorched flecks, no ash cones, only a faint white bloom upon the instruments and, oddly, upon the professor's eyelashes, as if a dust had settled on them." Holmes leaned forward. "And this lantern, describe it." "A brass dark lantern of his own manufacture, square in section with mica panels that may be shuttered in various ways. Within, instead of a simple wick and oil, he had contrived a secondary chamber with a perforated cylinder. I have seen him drop crystals there on occasion, producing a peculiar cold radiance. Forgive me, my knowledge is unequal to his. You observed the wick? Yes, that too puzzles me. It was charred but not consumed, blackened rather than burned away. The oil reservoir was scarcely diminished. Holmes's nostrils flared, a sign with him of rising excitement. You spoke of a visitor at 9:30. His name? I do not know it. I heard his voice through the door, a cultivated voice, steady yet with a sibilant whispering quality. The professor laughed once in the manner he affected when fencing with an equal. I thought nothing of it. And the professor's enemies? Hartwell hesitated. Science breeds rivalries. There is Mr. Jasper Meller, a financier whose funds supported a portion of our work. He pressed for public demonstration before the thing was secure. There is also Dr. Ezra Chalfont, a chemist jealous of the professor's forays upon his ground. And, well, there is Miss Lydia Vale. Aha, murmured Holmes. She is or was our laboratory artist, a draftswoman of rare talent. She and the professor had quarrelled last week. He accused her of pilfering a notebook. She accused him of stealing her ideas for a portable, shadowless lamp for the hospitals. She resigned summarily. Lestrade has all this? Holmes asked. I conveyed it to him this morning. He waved it aside. The man fell, he said. He struck his head, and all your talk of sorcerers' lamps is so much theatre. He proposes to close the matter. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, where the fog pressed like gauze against the panes. When he turned, the energy in him was unmistakable. There is no theatre in nature, Mr. Hartwell, only arrangements. Your professor has arranged something. Whether in his favour or against it, we shall see. You mentioned a white bloom upon the instruments and the eyelashes. Did any other surface bear it? The walls and ceiling faintly. When I touched the table, my glove shone, only for a second in the dimness of the corridor. It gave me an ill feeling. Phosphor, Holmes said softly to himself, or a cousin to it. He took down his hat and the long grey ulster that gives him in such weather an air of some tall, ascetic bird. Watson, your medical bag. I should like a lens, a scalpel, and a scrap of black velvet, if you possess it. I believe I can contrive all three, said I, Mr. Hartwell. Holmes went on. We shall accompany you to Waygate House at once. I would see this lantern that makes the world forget itself, and the floor upon which a man fell without the help of shadow. I do not permit accidents to explain paradoxes. Our client sprang up with a relief so pitifully evident that I felt a warmth toward him, beyond the courtesy due any supplicant to Baker Street. His hand shook as he took up his bag. If there is any fee, he began. Holmes dismissed it with a wave. We will speak of fees when we have something to charge you for beyond curiosity. At present, I am in your debt. There are few things in London more attractive to me than a contradiction. As we descended the stair, the door opened upon a gust of wet air and the odour of horse and coal. A newsboy cried murder somewhere down the street, and the fog swallowed his word as if it too were made of breath and doubt. Holmes's hand, light as a bird's wing, touched my sleeve. Note, Watson, he murmured, how many minds have fled already to the supernatural when a patient glance at the natural will do. A lantern without shadows is no more impossible than a mirror without reflection, if one first asks what precisely is meant by light, and a man dead by misadventure. I said. Holmes smiled with that wintry kindness which on rare occasions thawed his spare features. Accidents, my dear fellow, are events whose authors we have not yet named. Waygate House stood in a square of iron railings and blackened plane trees, its windows blurred by the same sullen vapour that had pursued us from Baker Street. Within, a stout porter with anxious eyes admitted us to a corridor that smelt of damp wool and chemicals. He led the way upstairs to a door whose lower panel showed a bruise where something hard had lately struck it. Inspector Lestrade, neat as ever, and with the confident air of a man who sees only what agrees with him, awaited us in the threshold. Morning, Mr. Holmes, Doctor. You will find nothing here to astonish you save the talk of our philosophers. The poor gentleman stumbled and paid for it. I should have wrapped the matter up an hour ago if Mr. Hartwell were not so romantic. Holmes's bow was a shade too polite. And yet romance, Inspector, is only the name we give to the parts of truth we have not yet measured. Pray let us measure. The laboratory beyond might have been a chapel to some exacting god. High cupboards of glass and mahogany lined the walls, each flocked faintly with a chalky bloom. The central table bore the square lantern of brass which Hartwell had described, a grim little ark with mica windows, its top pierced by a perforated chimney. An iron retort stand, planted like a gallows near the far edge, jutted at right angles over the floor. It was upon the corner of that arm, Lestrade informed us, that the professor had caught himself. Holmes stood very still, and I could feel his attention take possession of the room as a flame takes the shape of its vessel. Then he moved. The change was of degree rather than kind, a swifter stillness. "Do not touch the lantern," he said to Lestrade. "Watson, you have the velvet? Good. We shall profit by a dark background when a specimen is timid." "Timid?" Lestrade repeated. "Light, Inspector. It will sometimes flee the instrument that seeks it." Holmes unbuttoned his ulster and went first to the skirting near the door, kneeling to examine a smear there no more than the print of a thumb. From his pocket loop, he passed to his fingernails, scraping the faint white and letting it fall upon the black velvet in my hand. He sniffed. Faint, sulphurous tang with the garlic touch that betrays certain allotropes, yet not phosphorus as the apothecary knows it, nor our friend magnesium alone, Hartwell, who had hovered at a distance like a man torn between devotion and... Sacrilege made an involuntary sound. "You have not yet described," said Holmes without looking up, "how the lamp was found in detail." "As you see it," Hartwell said. The shutters of the windows were closed fast. The flame within the lantern burned, though low. The room glowed. Holmes rose and went to the shutters. Their bars were firmly shot. The inner faces showed a delicate pearly film, unevenly wiped at shoulder height. He looked at the ceiling, then at the retort stand, then at the floor where a dull brownish stain told of the professor's head. I knelt by the mark and laid my hand near it. There was no grit, no scatter of glass or ash, only the blunt print of a fall. The corner of the iron arm bore a dark polish, such as repeated handling produces, and at its angle a very minute thread of something transparent clung, so slight that the breath would have lost it. "Keep your hand steady. Watson." With the tip of his penknife, Holmes coaxed the filament free upon the velvet. "A collodion," he murmured. "Or a cousin to it. One of your varnishes, Mr. Hartwell." "Professor Venn used a photographic collodion to set certain coatings," Hartwell faltered. He had lately compounded what he called a balm for his luminous powders, to make them adhere without smothering their properties. Just so. Holmes's eye travelled to the upper moulding where the plaster took the light in a soft, unnatural way. He drew a chair beneath it, stood, and with the blade scraped again, this time not into my velvet but upon his thumbnail. "A paint," he said, "whose purpose is not to be seen until it is bidden. And how do we bid it? Not with warmth alone. There is scarcely a smutch of soot in the place, though the wick is black. Not with oil exhausted. Your reservoir is plump, Inspector. We shall soon ask the lantern." Lestrade shifted. "Ask it what? Whether it killed its owner? Mr. Holmes, you may bring all the fairies in the chemist's book, but here is a simple room and a man who fell. Permit me to try a conjuring trick." Then Holmes took from his pocket a little notebook, tore a leaf, and laid it over one of the mica panels. With his lens holder clipped to the lantern's chimney and my medical mirror angled upon the table, he opened the lantern's shutter with a delicacy that made Hartwell catch his breath. A thin, steady glow awoke, no flare, no leap of flame, rather a colourless radiance that seemed to wash the nearer instruments into a sameness, as moonlight sometimes does. On the leaf of paper, to which the mica gave shelter from that inner working, a faint shadow of the retort stand presented itself, a pale bar upon paler white. But beyond the paper, the stand's own outline dwindled and was lost, as if the light arrived from everywhere at once, and so denied the world its edges. "It is not shadowless," Holmes said, closing the shutter again. "It is indifferent to shadow. A diffused source acting upon a prepared surround, walls and ceiling that glow in answer, like actors who take their cue from a whisper. Your professor had made himself a sky indoors. If you will wipe with the back of your sleeve there, Lestrade, lightly, thank you. You observed the smear, and now, Watson, your velvet again." I held it beneath his knife. He gathered more of the bloom, and with a touch to his tongue, an action I confess made me wince, he made a face of scholarly distaste. "Barium salts or strontia, married to an organic binder. There is your balm. I will not settle it here. What matters is that the room, once awakened, gave back light from all directions. A man taking his step in such a stage misjudges distance, relief, the fall of his own hand. A small enough treachery to turn the corner of a rod into a weapon. Lestrade, who had watched the experiment, with a narrowing of his eyes, gestured at the floor. That at least supports my contention. It supports the possibility of misadventure, Holmes corrected. It does not satisfy the fact of a visitor at 9:30, the pressure of money for demonstration, nor the recent quarrel with a draftswoman who understands both line and light. Nor does it account for this. He knelt by the lantern and with a gloved finger touched the inside of its shutter. When he withdrew it, a faint pattern of ridges stood out in the white dust, an oval whirl and parallel lines. He held it under my lens, a woman's glove, he said softly. Fine kid, small hand, left forefinger slightly scarred at the tip. See how the ridge breaks? Someone besides Professor Venn handled the shutter after the bloom had risen, and handled it with some care, lest she mar the panel. Hartwell's face had grown very still. Miss Vale was left-handed, he whispered. She cut her forefinger on a glass slide last month. Your memory does not trust itself, Mr. Hartwell, said Holmes without irony. But in this it may serve. He straightened and examined the floor between table and door. The boards bore a faint crossing of marks where soft-soled shoes had gone and come many times. Among these, near the threshold, Holmes found a clearer print, not so much a footprint as a hesitation, the half-turn of a heel which had a peculiar raised lozenge at its center. A fashionable boot, I suggested. A resolute one, he returned. Our visitor of 9:30 had no such ornament. He walked with a level confidence, as men do who have practiced it for years. This mark belongs to a different temperament, poised and then ready to fly. He closed his lens and faced Lestrade. You may call this a fall if you like, Inspector, but you will not call it complete until we have found who wished the professor to fall in a room that denied him his own shadow, and why the lantern was left to argue for accident. I shall trouble Miss Lydia Vale first. Mr. Hartwell, her address. Hartwell, her address. Hartwell stammered it. Holmes made a note, snapped his pencil, and smiled that thin, abstracted smile which in him means not amusement, but the knitting of threads. One last favor, he said to the porter at the door. You smelt a sharp odor in the night. Have you noticed any other scent within this room this morning? Not of spirits, of something nearer the apothecary's shelf. The man sniffed, brow furrowed. There's a tang, sir. Like matches left too long in a drawer, and somewhat sweet underneath as if a lady had been. Holmes inclined his head. We shall see whether the lady preferred her sweetness bottled in a draftsman's case or printed on a visiting card. Come, Watson. There is shadow enough in Bloomsbury to find even when the room refuses it. The afternoon light had sunk to a sullen pewter when we quitted Waygate House. Holmes strode ahead through the mist, the set of his shoulders betraying the peculiar energy that gripped him when a case moved from speculation to pursuit. I confess my own mind was crowded with images from that singular room. The lantern, the bloom upon the walls, the faint whirl of a woman's gloved hand imprinted in dust. It was one thing to hear our client speak of shadowless light, another to stand within it and feel the world robbed of its natural outlines. Holmes hailed a cab, and we were soon jolting across the uneven stones toward Bloomsbury Square, where Miss Lydia Vale resided in a modest lodging-house. He remained silent for most of the ride, save to mutter once. A hand to a shutter is as telling as a signature upon a deed. It cannot be written without intent. His gaze stayed fixed upon the fog, outside as though it contained invisible script only he could decipher. Our cab drew up before a brick terrace whose neat curtains and polished doorbells suggested respectability. Touched with restraint, Holmes mounted the steps without hesitation and rapped in his decisive manner. A maid with red hands admitted us after some delay, and upon Holmes's request for Miss Vale, disappeared with a suspicious glance at his keen features. Presently she returned to conduct us up a narrow flight to a small parlor where the lady awaited. Lydia Vale rose from a writing desk as we entered. She was of middle height, with an artist's long fingers, her dark hair pinned carelessly yet with an effect not without charm. What struck me most, however, was the trace of tension about her eyes. They had the quick, alert look of one who anticipates interrogation before the first word is spoken. "Mr. Holmes," she said evenly, I thought it inevitable that you would come. Dr. Watson, I presume. Her courtesy was cool but not hostile. You wish to ask about Professor Venn? Holmes inclined his head. And about yourself, Miss Vale. You left his service within the week. I left because he accused me unjustly of theft, she returned, a flicker of heat in her voice. A notebook went missing, some sketches for the lamp he had been perfecting. He charged me with it. Though I had given months of my skill to drawing his contrivances with accuracy, no other hand could manage. I resigned rather than endure insult. Holmes's glance swept the room, lingering upon a half-finished sketch of architectural ornament pinned near the desk. You draw still, I see, but let us speak plainly. You were in Waygate House last night. A faint colour rose in her cheek, though she did not falter. Yes, I went there at 9 o'clock to demand restitution of my name. He refused to see me. We exchanged words through the closed door. That is all. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. You did not enter the laboratory? I did not. She met his gaze without blinking. Then you will forgive me if I ask to see your gloves. His tone was courteous but implacable. For a moment she stood motionless. Then, with the air of one submitting to an unwelcome necessity, she opened a drawer and produced a pair of kid gloves, pale grey and much worn at the fingers. Holmes examined them keenly, holding the left glove beneath my lens. The forefinger showed a tiny seam where the leather had been neatly stitched after some injury. He bent close, then handed them back with a bow. The cut, I perceive, was not imagined, he said softly. May I also inquire whether you are acquainted with Mr. Jasper Meller, the financier? She hesitated a fraction longer than comfort allows. I have met him once or twice in the professor's company. He was impatient for demonstration. I had little esteem for him. Nor he for you, perhaps, Holmes murmured. He drew himself up. Miss Vale, the circumstances of last night are such that your presence near the laboratory will be weighed carefully. It is not my office to pronounce guilt, but I must tell you the imprint of a gloved hand was found upon the lantern's shutter. The glove bore a scar precisely where yours do. Her breath caught. That proves nothing. Others may wear such gloves, and why should I desire the professor's death? He wronged me, yes, but I... She stopped short, and her fingers gripped the back of the chair with sudden force. Holmes's gaze softened, though his voice remained deliberate. Because, Miss Vale, there is more at stake than an accusation. That lantern is no mere curiosity. It promises wealth to those who control it, and ruin to those excluded. You knew its value. So did others. Did you see anyone else near the professor's rooms last night? Her eyes flickered, reluctance battling with some inner dread. At length she spoke. I heard voices. A man's voice, smooth but with a hiss to it, as though he spoke through clenched teeth. They were together only a short while. When I approached, the visitor passed me on the stair. He wore a tall hat and a muffler about his throat. I cannot swear to his face. Holmes's expression sharpened. Did he glance at you? He did not. But he carried himself with... She hesitated, searching, but with a kind of steadiness, as though nothing could discompose him. I shrank back, for I felt he would see through me if I met his eye. Holmes tapped his cane lightly against the floor, the rhythm of a man arranging thought. Thank you, Miss Vale. You have given me more than you suppose. I shall not trouble you further at present. Watson, come. As we descended the stairs, I whispered, Holmes, do you believe her? She has lied about one matter, he returned, but not about all. She has touched the lantern, though she would deny it. Yet I think she did so not in malice, but in fear, or in hope to prove something of her own claim. The man with the hissing voice concerns me more. Do you suspect Meller? I suspect ambition clothed in money. Meller would have motive enough. Yet there are other hands at play. Note, Watson, how she described his gait, steady, resolute. It matches not the hesitant mark upon the floor, but the earlier step Hartwell overheard. We have therefore two visitors, one at 9:30, one nearer to the time of death. The shadowless room concealed more than outlines. It concealed movements. He signaled the cab, his face alive with calculation. Our next call must be upon Mr. Meller. He holds the purse strings and perhaps the cord that drew Venn to his end. But we must tread carefully. Men who deal in lightless rooms sometimes prefer their fortunes to be built upon darkness. The carriage bore us westward through the dripping streets, past shop fronts half lost in fog, and the occasional glimmer of a gas lamp reflected in pools of water upon the stones. Holmes sunk deep in his ulster, appeared absorbed in silent calculation. I have long since learned that his silences are the very loom upon which he weaves his deductions, and so I forbore to intrude, though my own mind was restless with questions. Who was the visitor of the whispering voice? Had Lydia Vale touched the lantern in anger, or had she merely sought some proof of her claim to it? Above all, what hidden mechanism had Professor Venn contrived that rendered light itself a deceiver? At length Holmes stirred. Mellor maintains chambers in Lincoln's Inn Fields, does he not? A financier, a speculator, and, by report, a man whose enthusiasm for science is equalled only by his ignorance of it. I fancy we shall find him less reluctant to speak than our draftswoman. We arrived at a block of sober offices whose windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains. Within, a clerk in sober livery conducted us up a stair to a spacious room where Mr. Jasper Mellor received clients. The man himself stood at a broad desk, poring over sheaves of parchment with a pen held between thick fingers. He was of middle years, portly, his florid face fringed by side whiskers that gave him a bluff, confident aspect. Yet there was something watchful in his eye, as though his geniality were but a garment donned for the occasion. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he said with a bow that suggested equal parts courtesy and wariness. "And Dr. Watson, whose accounts of your adventures I have read with admiration. To what do I owe this honor? Surely not to discuss investments." His lips curved in a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. Holmes wasted no pleasantries. "We come regarding Professor Venn. You funded his experiments." Mellor's smile faded to a look of studied gravity. "A tragic loss, Mr. Holmes. The man had genius, but genius is not proof against a slippery floor and an ill-placed instrument. I have just penned a letter of condolence to the Royal Institution." Holmes's gaze fixed upon him. "Oh, you pressed him for demonstration, I believe." "I pressed him for results, sir, as any financier must. I do not expend thousands to line the drawers of a laboratory without some prospect of return." He promised much. A lamp to banish shadow, a revolution in surgery, perhaps even in war. Yet he delayed, forever chasing some finer principle. "I confess I grew impatient." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "So impatient that you visited him at 9:30 last evening." Mellor's brow furrowed. "Indeed I did. I called upon him briefly. We spoke heatedly perhaps, but parted without rancor. I had other engagements and left him in his laboratory alive and well. Can you account for your movements after?" Mellor's tone grew stiff. "I dined at the Albion with 2 colleagues from the Exchange. We remained until near midnight." "You may verify it." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "We shall. Tell me, Mr. Mellor, did Professor Venn confide to you that others sought his invention? A draftswoman, perhaps, or a rival chemist?" Mellor gave a short laugh. "Venn trusted no one, least of all me. He wrapped his secrets about him like a miser with his gold. If Miss Vale claims he stole her designs, that is their quarrel. There's for Chalfont. The man is a jealous pedant who resents any invasion of his petty dominions. I care little for their disputes. My concern is the fortune that died with the professor." Holmes's expression betrayed nothing. He studied Mellor with that calm intensity which makes even the most confident men shift in their seats. At last he said, "One last question. When you parted from Venn, what words did you exchange?" Mellor's face hardened. He said he would show me my impatience was folly, that within a week I should see a demonstration that would silence all doubt. I wished him good evening, and I left. Holmes rose, his manner courteous once more. "Thank you, Mr. Mellor. We shall trouble you no further for the moment." As we descended the stair, I asked softly, "Do you believe him, Holmes?" "Partly. He was indeed there at 9:30. Of that I have no doubt. But his alibi after may not be as watertight as he supposes. Yet he spoke one truth unwittingly, and that the professor promised a demonstration within a week. A man does not speak so if he intends suicide, nor if he feels his invention a failure. Someone feared that demonstration, Watson, and ensured it would never take place. We had just reached the street when a sudden figure loomed from the fog. It was Hartwell, breathless and pale, clutching his hat to his head against the drizzle. "Mr. Holmes, thank heaven I found you. There has been another discovery." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "At Waygate House?" "Yes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pike, went this evening to air the professor's rooms. She found a slip of paper wedged beneath the door. Overlooked before, no doubt. It bears but a few words scrawled in haste. She brought it to me. I feared to lose you, so I hurried out at once." He pressed a folded scrap into Holmes's hand. By the glow of a nearby lamp, we read the uneven script. It said only the lamp must not be shown. Meet me at the usual place, midnight. The signature was a mere initial. E. Holmes folded the paper with care. Our case deepens, Watson. Heirs Ezra Chalfont, I make no doubt. He feared exposure, and arranged a meeting whose secrecy is betrayed by its very haste. Tonight, then, we must look to discover who keeps tryst at midnight, and in what usual place. And if it is a trap. Holmes's smile was thin, his eyes alight with cold resolve. Then let us walk willingly into it. A trap may be sprung by either hand, my dear fellow, and I intend it shall not be ours that closes. We returned with Hartwell to Baker Street, the fog curling about the lamplight like a curtain reluctant to fall. Holmes spread the scrap of paper upon the table and regarded it as though it were a chessboard containing the entire game. I examined it too, noting the jaggedness of the hand, as if the writer had been pressed for time or disturbed by agitation. The single initial E seemed at once careless and deliberate, a veil drawn halfway. Holmes held the paper up to the lamp. A cheap pencil upon coarse foolscap, torn hastily from a larger sheet, see the ragged edge. The fibers suggest it came from a laboratory notebook rather than a letter pad. Watson, what does that tell you? That the writer had no leisure to procure finer paper, I ventured, and seized what lay at hand. Precisely. A note scribbled in urgency, but with intent enough to conceal identity. Chalfont is the obvious candidate, yet we must not neglect that there may be more than one E in this little drama. He paced the room with quick strides. We must discover the usual place. Hartwell, did Professor Venn keep any habitual meeting grounds? Hartwell frowned in thought. He sometimes met Chalfont at the Balthazar Coffee House near Holborn. They argued there more than once, and yet it was always their resort for private discussion. Holmes's eyes glinted. The Balthazar at midnight. A place open late. Its corners dim, its clientele mixed enough to conceal conspirators. Watson, we shall be in attendance, though not in the manner its waiters expect. By 10 o'clock we were equipped. Holmes had exchanged his usual attire for a rough seaman's jacket, his face darkened with a dab of pigment that lent him a weathered, salt-bitten appearance. I myself was less altered, save for a muffler and hat pulled low, though Holmes declared it sufficient for our purpose. Hartwell begged leave to accompany us, but Holmes forbade it. A witness may be seen when an investigator must not, he said firmly. Remain at your rooms, sir, and await my summons. The Balthazar proved to be a low establishment tucked into a corner off the main thoroughfare, its windows greasy with lamplight and tobacco smoke. A babble of voices greeted us as we entered. Clerks, students, a scattering of artisans. The odor of strong coffee mingled with stale bread and damp wool. Holmes, in his assumed character, led us to a table near the rear where the shadows clung thickest. From there we commanded a view of the door and the greater portion of the room. Minutes dragged. I confessed to a mounting unease, for I knew that Holmes, for all his confidence, ventured into danger willingly. At 11:45 the door admitted a man wrapped in a greatcoat, his hat pulled low, a muffler about his throat. His carriage was erect, his step deliberate, exactly as Miss Vale had described of the earlier visitor. He took a seat at a table near the centre, removed his gloves with deliberate precision, and ordered a coffee. I could not see his full face, but the line of his jaw and the sweep of his whiskers proclaimed him Jasper Meller. Holmes's hand closed lightly upon my arm. Observe, Watson, not Chalfont but Meller, keeping tryst in another's stead, or perhaps with another accomplice. Let us wait. The clock above the counter struck midnight. Almost upon the stroke a second figure entered, a thinner man, nervous in his movements, his hat pushed back to reveal sharp features and restless eyes. He glanced about swiftly before seating himself opposite Meller. Holmes breathed low in my ear. Ezra Chalfont, beyond question. The two bent their heads together. We could not hear their words above the clatter of cups and scrape of chairs, but their gestures spoke volumes. Meller leaning forward with blunt insistence, Chalfont protesting with quick, slicing motions of his hands. Once Meller's fist struck the table, causing the cups to rattle, and Chalfont recoiled as if struck in truth, Holmes's eyes never left them. There, Watson, is the motive spelled in pantomime. Meller has the purse, Chalfont the knowledge. Between them lay Venn's invention, and between them also lies his corpse. We sat thus for near 20 minutes, until at last Chalfont rose abruptly, threw down a coin, and left with hurried steps. Mellor remained a moment longer, composing himself with slow sips of coffee, before departing by the opposite door. Holmes rose. "Come, we must follow Chalfont. Mellor will keep till morning." We shadowed the chemist through twisting streets until he turned into a narrow alley that debouched upon a yard littered with barrels and refuse. He halted there, glancing about with the wary air of a hunted man. Holmes drew me back into the gloom, and we waited. Presently a third figure detached itself from the deeper shadow of the wall. A woman's figure, slender, cloaked, and with a hood drawn over her head. She spoke a single word I could not catch, and Chalfont answered with an emphatic gesture. They conversed rapidly, the woman's voice low but urgent, Chalfont's growing shriller with each reply. Then she thrust something into his hand, turned sharply and vanished into the mist. Holmes's breath hissed softly between his teeth. "Watson, did you mark her gait?" The long stride, the quick certainty of step. That was Lydia Vale. So the circle closes. Mellor and Chalfont conspire, yet the draftswoman plays her own hand. What passed between them we must learn, and soon. We trailed Chalfont no further, for Holmes judged pursuit then would betray us. Instead we withdrew, taking a circuitous route back to Baker Street. Holmes was silent most of the way, his eyes gleaming with inward fire. At last he said, "3 hands upon 1 lantern, Watson, and each believes it his or hers alone. Mellor covets the profit, Chalfont the discovery, Miss Vale perhaps the vindication of her own claim. But only 1 hand left the professor dead upon his floor. Which and why, that is the nut we must untie. Tomorrow we pay a call upon Dr. Ezra Chalfont in his own den. There we may learn whether science is still his master, or whether greed has usurped the throne." The following morning broke with a pallid sun that seemed reluctant to pierce the London haze. Holmes, already astir when I descended to breakfast, was engaged in sorting a small array of powders and phials upon the table, his long fingers as deft as a surgeon's. He looked up briefly, his grey eyes alight with suppressed energy. "Watson, our quarry is narrowing. Last night gave us a glimpse of the inner mechanism, Mellor supplying gold, Chalfont providing skill, and Miss Vale, the artist, holding a fragment of knowledge both wished to possess. But the machine has yet to reveal which cog has ground Venn to death." "You propose to confront Chalfont this morning?" I asked. "Precisely. His laboratory is in Clerkenwell. I have arranged a plausible pretext. Hartwell will accompany us as a fellow man of science seeking discourse. You, Watson, will play the watchful eye. The man may attempt bluster, but he cannot disguise evidence when pressed by experiment." By noon we had arrived at a tall, narrow building in a street of modest workshops. A brass plate bore the name Dr. Ezra Chalfont, chemical consultant. Within, the air was acrid with spirits of ammonia and the sharp tang of acids. Chalfont himself emerged from behind a bench crowded with retorts and crucibles. His figure was slight, his eyes quick and darting, and his thin lips twisted into a smile that failed to conceal unease. "Mr. Holmes," he said with forced heartiness, "and Dr. Watson, if I mistake not, to what good fortune do I owe your visit? Surely you come not to cast suspicion upon a poor chemist, merely because Professor Venn suffered a fall." Holmes inclined his head with icy politeness. "We come not with suspicion, but with inquiry. The death of Professor Venn leaves questions, scientific questions, which I fancy only you can illuminate. You were his critic, perhaps his rival. Yet rivalry often conceals respect." Chalfont's eyes flickered. "Respect, yes, though he trespassed upon fields not his own. Still, I would not wish him harm." Holmes wandered among the benches, fingering a retort here, a crucible there, his manner casual yet precise. At last he paused before a small chest of drawers. From one he drew a vial of milky powder, unstopped it and sniffed delicately. A faint phosphorescence lingered upon the rim. "This substance," Holmes said, "is curious. It emits light under certain conditions, does it not? A cousin, perhaps, to the bloom we observed at Waygate House." Chalfont's smile stiffened. "A mere experiment, unfinished, of no consequence, yet one that binds itself to collodion and adheres to surfaces most tenaciously. In a room treated with it, a lantern of Venn's design would awaken the walls into a uniform glow, robbing objects of shadow and misleading the eye. A marvel, but also a snare for the unwary." The chemist's hand trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. "If the professor misused such substances, the fault is his own. I cannot be held answerable for another's folly. Holmes turned, his voice like steel. "And yet you kept a midnight appointment with Mellor at the Balthazar." Chalfont recoiled as if struck, his colour draining. "So you spied—" "I observed," Holmes interrupted. "And I observed more. You met afterwards with Miss Vale. She gave you something. Shall I tell you what it was? A fragment of Ven's notebook, torn in haste, bearing formula you coveted." Chalfont's lips worked, but no sound emerged. Hartwell, who had stood silent till now, burst out, "You traitor! Ven trusted you despite your quarrels, and you conspired with Mellor to rob him." "Silence, Hartwell," Holmes commanded, though his eyes never left Chalfont. "The truth does not emerge from accusation, but from evidence. Tell me, Doctor, why did you insist the lamp must not be shown?" For a moment Chalfont seemed to wrestle with himself. Then, with sudden vehemence, he cried, "Because it was unfinished. Ven would have paraded it before men unfit to judge, would have declared it complete when its principles were yet crude. I warned him it was unsafe, dangerous. The radiance he conjured was unstable, its powders volatile. I feared it might harm more than heal." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "So you wrote the note?" Chalfont sank upon a stool, his head in his hands. "Yes, I begged him to delay. I meant to reason with him again. But Mellor pressed me, demanding a spectacle to satisfy investors. When I saw Ven would not bend, I thought to frighten him into caution. I never meant his death. Then whose hand turned fear into murder?" Holmes's voice was low, relentless. Chalfont looked up, eyes wild. "Mellor," he would stop at nothing. If Ven refused to yield, Mellor might have forced his silence. "But I cannot prove it. I swear I did not kill him." Holmes regarded him long, then turned to me. "Watson, you see how the pieces align, yet not in final order." Chalfont's fear was real, but his weakness left him pliable in another's grasp. Mellor's will is the stronger. His hand may have pressed the fatal stroke. He closed the vial with precision, set it back, and addressed the chemist once more. "Dr. Chalfont, you will remain at my disposal. Do not attempt to leave London. The law may not yet call you, but truth most certainly will." Outside in the street, Hartwell's agitation broke forth. "Holmes, surely the man's confession proves guilt enough." Holmes shook his head. "Confession to a note, yes, but not to murder. The true hand upon the lantern remains to be shown. We must next examine Mellor's alibi. Watson, recall his words. He dined at the Albion until midnight. Let us see whether the Albion remembers him as fondly as he remembers it." And with that, Holmes hailed a cab, his face set with the grim satisfaction of a hound that has caught the scent full in its nostrils. The trail was tightening, and I felt instinctively that the moment of revelation drew nearer with every turn of the wheel. The Albion stood on a busy corner of Ludgate Hill, a place of dark oak beams gleaming pewter, and the perpetual hum of merchants and clerks exchanging the day's gossip. Holmes led the way through its crowded hall, his eyes moving over every detail with the brisk certainty of a man already mapping lies against truth. We found the proprietor, a round-shouldered fellow with a genial but wary expression, standing behind the bar. "Mr. Jasper Mellor," Holmes said without preamble, "claims to have dined here with two companions until near midnight on Tuesday last. Do you recall him?" The man rubbed his chin. "Mellor? Aye, he's been in often enough. Tuesday. Yes, he came, but he did not stay long. Ordered a cut of beef and a flask of claret. He was gone well before 10. Left his two friends behind." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And his companions, who were they?" "Messrs. Colthurst and Brindle, both exchange men. They lingered until closing, but Mellor had some pressing matter, or so he said." Holmes inclined his head in thanks and pressed a coin across the counter. We withdrew to a quiet corner where the din of voices dulled. "You see, Watson," Holmes murmured, "his vaunted alibi crumbles. He departed early enough to pay his visit to Ven and contrive all that followed." I felt a tightening in my chest. "Then Mellor is the murderer." Holmes raised a hand. "Caution, my dear fellow. His lie reveals opportunity, not guilt. Yet it brings the web into sharper relief. He had the motive, profit, and the will. But how to prove his hand upon the fatal lantern? That is the task." As we stepped back into the chill dusk, the fog was thickening once more, swallowing outlines until the lamps floated like globes in a grey sea. Holmes hailed a cab and we rode in silence until at last he tapped the roof and had us set down near the Strand. He drew me into the shadow of an archway and spoke in a low, taut voice. "Mellor's falsehood makes him dangerous. He knows the net is drawing tight, and such men strike hardest when cornered. We must therefore strike first. I propose to lure him into betraying himself. And how? I asked. By means of the lantern itself. I shall reconstruct the conditions of the professor's death, light, bloom, and all. Mellor, confronted by that treacherous radiance, will betray his knowledge of it in some involuntary act. It is not enough to accuse him. We must compel him to reveal his own guilt. The boldness of the plan sent a shiver down my spine, yet I could not but admire its ingenuity. And where will this reconstruction take place? Why, at Waygate House, of course. The room remains as it was, and the evidence still clings to its walls. I shall make my preparations tonight. Tomorrow we shall invite Mellor there under pretext of a final inquiry. But first we must ensure his presence, and that requires tact. We parted briefly, Holmes vanishing into the fog with the silent swiftness of a shadow. When he returned to Baker Street near midnight, his expression bore the satisfaction of a stratagem secured. Mellor, he said, believes he is to meet me tomorrow evening to discuss a means of preserving his financial interest in Venn's invention. He suspects nothing of the stage I shall set. Watson, you and Hartwell will be my audience, an audience I trust to a confession that needs no words. The following day was spent in elaborate preparation. Holmes secured certain chemicals and powders, and together we revisited Waygate House under cover of Hartwell's authority. In the laboratory, Holmes moved with the precision of a dramatist arranging scenery. He scraped residue from the walls, mixed it with Chalfont's powder, and spread it in faint films across the plaster. The lantern restored to its table he examined minutely, adjusting the shutters with delicate fingers. "Watson, mark this corner," he said, indicating the iron retort stand. "Here lies the crux. To the careless eye in that unnatural glow, the corner vanishes until it is too late. I shall contrive the light so that the room becomes once more a chamber without shadow. Then we shall see whether Mellor can endure its deceit without betraying the memory of how it was used." Evening fell, and the fog pressed thick against the windows. A knock announced Mellor, his broad frame filling the doorway, his manner outwardly genial but his eyes darting with calculation. Holmes welcomed him with urbane courtesy, gesturing him toward the central table. "Mr. Mellor," he said, "you desired proof that Venn's lamp could yield profit. I propose tonight to show you its marvel, so that you may judge whether its worth exceeds your loss." Mellor chuckled. "A strange hour for a demonstration, Mr. Holmes, but I am willing to be amused." Holmes closed the shutters tight, leaving the room in near darkness. Then, with a flourish, he opened the lantern. A colorless radiance spread outward, striking the treated walls until the entire chamber glowed with uniform brilliance. Instruments lost their edges, shadows fled, and the air seemed alive with light without source. Mellor's confident expression faltered for the briefest instant as he glanced about him, his eyes betraying recognition and unease. Holmes observed keenly. "Remarkable, is it not, Watson? See how the stand there dissolves into air, invisible until one's foot strikes it." He moved slightly, letting his hand hover near the iron corner. Mellor stiffened, his breath catching, and his gaze fixed upon that very spot as though compelled by memory. Holmes's voice was silk over steel. "Curious that you should watch that corner, Mr. Mellor. Why does it command your attention so?" "Unless, of course, you already know its treachery," Mellor blustered. "Nonsense. Any man might fear stumbling in such a glow." Holmes stepped closer, his tone cutting. "Any man, yes, but not every man would remember where precisely to look, unless he had seen another fall there. Professor Venn did not rise again, and you, sir, were present when he fell." The financier's face darkened, his mouth working, but no denial came forth. His fists clenched, then relaxed as if he had weighed the futility of protest. The light bathed his features in ghastly pallor, and for an instant he looked less a man than a figure carved from stone. Holmes snapped the shutter closed. Darkness rushed in, broken only by the hiss of Mellor's quickened breath. "Enough," Holmes said. "The law will have its due, and you will find that shadowless rooms cannot conceal guilt." We escorted Mellor from the house, his silence more damning than any outburst. Outside, Lestrade waited with 2 constables, having been summoned by Holmes in advance. As Mellor was led away, the inspector gave a grunt of satisfaction. "Another case neatly tied, Mr. Holmes. You've the devil's own luck." Holmes shook his head. "Not luck, Inspector, observation. Shadows may vanish, but human nature never does. And with that, he turned back into the fog, already moving ahead of us, as though the chase had merely shifted to some new quarry hidden in the labyrinth of London's night. The fog still clung to Baker Street when we returned, and Holmes, instead of displaying the satisfaction I had expected, paced the room with restless steps, his brows drawn low. I had seen him at the close of many cases, basking in the quiet glow of triumph, but here there was no such repose. He lit his pipe, sank into his chair, then rose again almost at once as though unable to sit still. "You are dissatisfied," I ventured. "Yet Mellor has been taken, and surely his guilt was plain to all who watched him." Holmes sent a thin wisp of smoke curling toward the ceiling. "Plain, yes, but too plain, Watson. He was the financier, the one with the purse and the appetite. That he lied about his alibi damns him, and yet—" He broke off and tapped the bowl of his pipe. "I fear the case has been made to fit too neatly, as though someone had drawn lines for us to follow. Such arrangements seldom occur without a hidden hand." I thought of Lydia Vale, of her resolute stride as she vanished into the mist outside the Balthazar, and a suspicion stirred. "You believe another stands behind Mellor?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I believe that Mellor was no more than the visible edge of a design more subtle. He may have struck the blow, but the pattern that placed the lantern, that timed the quarrels, that planted the bloom upon the walls, those may be traced to another mind. Let us examine what we know. Mellor desired profit, Chalfont desired caution, Vale desired vindication. Which of these motives aligns most closely with the precise contrivance of that room?" He rose, drew the professor's notebook from Hartwell's bag, borrowed earlier for study, and laid it open upon the table. Pages of formulae, sketches of the lantern, diagrams of reflective surfaces filled the leaves. "Note here, Watson, the draftsmanship. Too exact, too fine to be Ven's hand. Miss Vale's touch is everywhere. She understood the mechanism as well as he. If the invention was to be stolen, who better than she to provide its secrets? And if Mellor was to be the blunt instrument, who better to set him in motion?" The idea startled me, though it explained much that had troubled me. But she accused Ven of theft. Why should she kill him? Because vindication may be bought at a higher price than justice. If the world were shown the lantern as Ven's alone, her claim would vanish. But if he were removed, and Mellor made to blunder into guilt, she might emerge the sole possessor of knowledge, and with it both profit and revenge. It is a theory only, but theories must be tested. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. Her message was delivered by hand not an hour later, scrawled in the same swift script we had seen before. It read, "The lamp must not be lost. Meet me at Waygate House 11 tonight. Come alone." The signature this time was not E, but L. Holmes smiled coldly. "Our hidden hand writes again. She believes Mellor's removal leaves the field clear. Very well, we shall meet her terms, but not her conditions. Watson, we shall go together." That night we returned to the silent house in Bloomsbury. The porter, bribed by Holmes, admitted us and withdrew. The laboratory lay dark, the lantern brooding upon its table like a thing alive. We waited in the shadows, scarcely breathing. At a few minutes past 11, the door creaked softly and a cloaked figure slipped within. Lydia Vale pushed back her hood, her eyes bright with feverish determination. She crossed swiftly to the lantern and laid her hand upon it with a kind of proprietary reverence. Holmes stepped from the gloom. "Miss Vale, I fear your meeting is not as solitary as you wished." She started, her hand flying to her breast. For a moment she seemed about to flee, but then her gaze hardened. "So you have guessed. Very well. Mellor is in custody, and I suppose you think the matter ended. But you are wrong. That lamp is mine by right, my designs, my skill. He stole them, as he stole my reputation. Why should he live to profit while I am cast aside?" "Because murder cannot confer authorship," Holmes said, his voice calm but edged. "You arranged the bloom upon these walls. You guided Mellor's heavy hand. You planted the evidence to point to him. A clever stage, Miss Vale, but one step too artful. You touched the shutter with your scarred glove, and you forgot that even a lantern without shadow cannot hide a fingerprint." She laughed bitterly. "And yet who will believe you? Mellor was seen, Mellor lied, Mellor profited. I only sought to reclaim what was mine." Holmes's gaze was like ice. "The law will judge whether theft justifies killing. But you will not leave this house as its mistress of light. You will leave it under guard." At that moment, Lestrade entered with 2 constables summoned by Holmes earlier. Lydia Vale stood motionless, her face pale but her eyes still burning. She offered no struggle as they led her away. When the door closed behind them, I exhaled a breath I had scarcely known I held. So it was she all along. Mella but a puppet, Chalfont a dupe, and Venn the sacrifice to her ambition. Holmes extinguished the lantern and closed its shutter with deliberate care. Ambition, Watson, is a flame more dangerous than any phosphorus. It blinds as well as it burns. She sought a world without shadow, and in the end she could not escape her own. We left Waygate House together, the fog thinning now as the wind shifted. The lamps along the street once more cast their familiar pools of light, and for the first time in days I found comfort in the honest presence of shadows stretching faithfully at our heels. The next morning dawned bright after days of fog, as though London itself sought to shrug off the shadows of the affair. Yet within Baker Street, the atmosphere was not one of ease. Holmes sat in his armchair, the lantern from Waygate House now resting upon our table, like an intruder whose presence could not be ignored. He regarded it with that peculiar mixture of fascination and distaste I had seen only when he confronted inventions that blurred the line between science and trickery. "You are restless still," I remarked, for I had hoped that Lydia Vale's arrest might have brought him his accustomed serenity. "Restless, yes," he admitted. "Because, Watson, I dislike the sense that I have been made a party to a performance rather than a pursuit. The lady contrived a drama in which Mella played villain, Chalfont the hapless accomplice, and we the audience. That we pulled aside her curtain at the final act does not satisfy me. There is something in this lantern, something in Venn's final hours that has not yet spoken." He rose abruptly, set the lantern upon the hearthrug, and drew down the shutters so that the room plunged into darkness. Then, opening the contrivance in a single motion, he bathed the sitting-room in its ghastly glow. The wallpaper, the bookshelves, even the curve of Holmes's face seemed suddenly robbed of depth, flattened into pallid surfaces. Shadows fled to nothing. My own hand, when raised before the fire-iron, betrayed not the faintest outline. Holmes's voice cut through the whiteness. "You feel it, Watson?" The disorientation? Venn was struck not merely by Mella's hand or Vale's ambition, but by the treachery of light itself. Whoever stood in this room with him could predict that a man so placed must stumble, must fall. Murder by architecture, if you will. A stage upon which accident and intent became indistinguishable. The lantern's radiance wavered, and Holmes snapped the shutter closed with a decisive clang. Normal light crept back in, shadows returning like faithful companions. We shall ensure the courts know it was no accident, though the manner was devilishly contrived. But we must also prevent this from being repeated. Hartwell must decide whether the invention should survive at all. At that moment, Hartwell himself was announced. He entered hesitantly, his expression torn between grief and relief. "You have done what I scarcely dared hope, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Miss Vale is in custody," Mellor exposed, "and Chalfont humbled. The professor has his justice. And yet I cannot shake the horror of it. The lantern, the bloom upon the walls, the sense that light itself had turned traitor." Holmes gestured him to a chair. "You are right to be troubled. The lamp is a marvel, but a peril as well. Its principle lies not merely in banishing shadow, but in banishing truth. Men depend upon the honest fall of shade to guide their senses. Rob them of that, and you rob them of certainty. Venn dreamed of a world without shadow, yet it cost him his life." Hartwell bent forward, clasping his hands. "What would you have me do? Burn his papers? Destroy the lamp?" Holmes considered a moment. "That is not mine to say, but I would urge caution. The invention may yet serve medicine as he intended if tamed, but in the hands of the unscrupulous it becomes a weapon. Decide with wisdom, Hartwell, and with conscience." For a time we sat in silence, the weight of the matter pressing upon us all. At last Hartwell rose, his decision unspoken but written upon his grave features. "I shall not let it pass into Mellor's heirs nor into the market. The professor's legacy must not be remembered as a trick of shadows, but as the pursuit of knowledge, however flawed. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, and you, Dr. Watson. I owe you both more than I can say." When he had gone, I turned to Holmes. "You have brought the truth to light, yet you remain unsatisfied." He smiled faintly, that wintry smile of his that was not warmth, but acknowledgment of some inward amusement. "Not unsatisfied, Watson, only thoughtful. Each case teaches us something beyond the crime itself. Here I have learned that shadows, which men often curse, are in fact their safeguard. To live always in unbroken light is to live without form, without guide, without truth. It is a paradox worthy of philosophy, though it cost a life to prove it. I could not but reflect upon his words as I made my notes of the case in the days that followed. The newspapers were filled with the scandal. A financier disgraced, a chemist ruined, a brilliant draftswoman unmasked as a murderess. Yet few remarked upon the strangest feature of all, the lantern that revealed no shadows. That detail was dismissed as fancy, or explained away by journalists eager for simpler tales. Only I knew through Holmes how dangerously real it had been. One evening, a week later, I found Holmes again with the lantern before him, turning it slowly in his hands. "You will not keep it, surely?" I asked, half in alarm. "No, Watson. Its place is not in Baker Street. Tomorrow it will go to the custody of the institution, sealed and inert, until some wiser generation chooses its fate. But tonight," he paused, his gaze distant, "tonight I shall look once more upon its light, not as detective but as philosopher, to remind myself that even the absence of shadow has its own darkness. He opened the shutter a fraction, letting the pallid glow spill across his face. For an instant, he seemed himself a figure painted in 2 dimensions, a man without depth, his keen eyes burning oddly flat. Then he snapped it closed and laughed softly. "Enough. Back to shadows, Watson. They suit me better." And so the case of the lantern that revealed no shadows passed into memory, leaving behind it not only the triumph of detection, but the strange impression that truth itself may sometimes be found more readily in the faithful fall of shade than in the blinding brilliance of light. It was several evenings later when the case, which I had thought concluded, revealed one last hidden chamber. I had finished writing my account and was preparing for bed when Holmes, who had been unusually silent over supper, suddenly tossed aside the Persian slipper that served as his tobacco jar and exclaimed, "Watson, the pattern is incomplete. We have the motive, the opportunity, the instrument, but not the spark that turned calculation into murder. That spark still eludes me." I protested that Lydia Vale's confession and Mellor's lies were more than sufficient for any court, but Holmes shook his head with quiet severity. "The law is content with sufficiency, but my mind requires completion. The human chain of reasoning must close as neatly as the scientific one. Unless we find that final link, I cannot rest." He rose and fetched from the shelf the professor's notebook, which Hartwell had left with him for safekeeping until the institution might claim it. Holmes turned the pages rapidly, stopping at a diagram half smeared with graphite. "Observe, Watson. This sketch bears 2 hands, the professor's coarse scrawl and Vale's delicate lines. Here in the margin are notations in yet another script, slanted and precise. Whose hand is this?" I bent closer. Not Mellor's, certainly. He could scarcely write his own name so tidily. "Chalfont, perhaps?" Holmes nodded. "Exactly. Chalfont's script. He not only handled the powders, but touched the theories themselves. Yet he swore to us he sought only to restrain Venn. Why then his notes upon refinement, improvement, even correction? The chemist was not merely a rival, Watson. He was a collaborator, albeit in secret. Vale may have shaped the diagrams, but Chalfont corrected the equations. Their quarrels concealed a partnership. The implication startled me. Then Vale did not act alone. On the contrary, she acted with unwitting allies. Mellor with his gold, Chalfont with his formulas, she with her draftsmanship. Each believed the other expendable, but together they gave Venn both his invention and his death. It was not one conspirator, but 3. And yet the hand that struck was Vale's, for ambition outweighed caution and profit alike. Holmes closed the book with a snap. Now the circle is whole. The lamp was not merely stolen. It was forged in a crucible of rivalry, greed, and pride. No single motive sufficed, but the alloy of 3 made murder inevitable. The next morning we were summoned to the yard, where Lestrade awaited us with his usual mixture of relief and exasperation. "You've made my work the devil's own tangle, Mr. Holmes," he grumbled. "First Mellor, then Vale, and now you tell me Chalfont had his hand in it too. I've half a mind to charge the whole lot of them, and let the judge decide who killed whom." Holmes's expression softened only slightly. "You may do as you think fit, Inspector, but the essence remains. Venn died because his invention was coveted by 3 and guarded by none. I leave it to the law to distribute punishment. My task is only to show where the threads converge. That evening, Hartwell called once more, his face pale but his manner composed. He had resolved the question that had weighed so heavily on him. "I shall burn the powders," he declared, "and seal away the designs. The world is not yet ready for a light without shadow. Let it rest with the professor, and with him alone." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "A wise choice. There are discoveries, Watson, that should remain in the laboratory rather than the market. A civilization may be measured as much by what it refuses as by what it adopts." When Hartwell departed, silence fell in our sitting room. I looked at the lantern upon the mantel, now sealed with wax and rendered inert. Its brass sides reflected the flicker of our honest fire, which cast its natural shadows upon the walls. Holmes leaned back, his pipe in hand, and regarded the play of light and dark with an almost wistful gaze. "There is poetry, Watson, in the common shadow. It shapes the world, it gives proportion, it anchors man to reality. Strip it away and you strip away depth itself." Vale dreamed of a world without darkness, but she forgot that without shade, light blinds rather than reveals. I made no reply, for I felt that nothing could add to the weight of his reflection. We sat thus, companionably, while outside the street grew quiet, save for the distant rattle of a cab and the murmur of the city settling into night. The case of the lantern that revealed no shadows had ended, yet its lesson lingered, an uneasy reminder that the pursuit of brilliance, unchecked by conscience, may cast a darkness deeper than any shadow. At last Holmes spoke again, more lightly. "I trust, Watson, that you will not give my words too much of a philosopher's gravity in your account. Leave such musings to those who fill lecture halls. For myself, I prefer the simpler pleasure of a pipe, a case, and the occasional reminder that the world is best seen in contrast, not in uniform glare." He rose, stirred the fire, and the room warmed with the cheerful glow of honest flame. Its shadows leapt and danced upon the walls, faithful companions restored. And so, in that ordinary play of light and shade, the extraordinary affair was gently laid to rest. The matter, though formally concluded, lingered in the public imagination for several weeks. The newspapers, ever eager for sensation, fastened on Lydia Vale's fall from respected draftswoman to accused murderess, while Mellor's disgrace proved equally fertile ground for scandal. Chalfont, though spared indictment, withdrew in humiliation. His name whispered more with pity than respect. Scotland Yard declared the business a triumph of its vigilance, though I knew, as did Lestrade in his private honesty, how much of the truth had been revealed only by Holmes's relentless pursuit of every inconsistency. For my own part, I felt a lingering unease. Though justice had been served, the lantern itself haunted my thoughts. That pallid, shadowless glow seemed a thing unnatural, as though it had pierced not merely the air of the laboratory, but some deeper fabric of perception. I remarked as much to Holmes one evening as we sat in our rooms, the lamp on our table casting its honest circle of light, edged by natural darkness. Holmes regarded me with his rare, quiet smile. "You are not alone, Watson." The contrivance unsettled me as well. It is not often that I meet with an invention whose danger lies not in its explosion or its poison, but in its capacity to unseat the very senses upon which truth depends. Without shadow, proportion vanishes, distance deceives, and the solid world becomes a treacherous surface. Vale thought she had found power in its strangeness, but she had forgotten that man requires shade as surely as light. Shadows tell us where we stand. He rose, crossed to the mantel where the sealed lantern lay, and placed a hand upon it as if in judgment. "This object, Watson, will never again be used. Hartwell has promised to consign it to the vaults of the institution, where it shall remain locked and inert. And so it should be. There are discoveries which, though remarkable, do not serve mankind when released. Better to let them rest until wisdom, not ambition, calls them forth." I could not resist pressing him further. "And what of you, Holmes? Do you count this among your greatest cases?" He gave a short laugh, almost self-mocking. "Greatness, my dear fellow, lies not in the complexity of the crime, but in the clarity of its solution. This affair will never stand beside the Hound upon Dartmoor or the Serpent in the Night. Yet it taught me a lesson I value, that in chasing light too fiercely, men may stumble into darkness of their own making. It is a paradox worthy of any philosopher, though I prefer to leave philosophy to others." We spoke little more that night. I recall the fire burning low, its flames casting long, faithful shadows across our familiar room. Outside, the city murmured as it always did, indifferent to the dramas that had unfolded in its midst. Holmes, at last content, leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, his pipe sending thin spirals into the lamplight. So ended the curious case of the lantern that revealed no shadows, a case which began with a paradox of light and ended with the revelation that even brilliance may conceal its own darkness. And though the world at large soon forgot it amidst the endless tide of fresh scandals, I knew I had witnessed one of Holmes's most singular triumphs, not merely the unmasking of a murderer, but the restoration of shadow itself to its rightful place beside the light. Beside the light.